Okay, we're gonna start and hopefully people will continue to join. Um, Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of you all around the world. And welcome to Shifting Power and Forced Displacement, Pathways Towards Equitable Partnerships panel. We're really thrilled to have you here. Actually, this panel and this event was supposed to be in person in Geneva, but I'm kind of feeling very glad it's virtual. Many of you is here, it's more inclusive and it's safer for all of us. And before I introduce myself and we start the conversation, there's just a few housekeeping things, as always, that I would like to share with you. First, I would like to remind myself and everyone who's going to speak slowly, because gratefully we have interpretation. The webinar is being recorded and will be we will have it on all our Asylum Access channels. Interpretation is available for Arabic, French, and Spanish. So at the bottom bar in your Zoom screen, where there's a globe, you can choose your preferred language. And just if the box, you make sure please to enable the Q&A, where you can see the Q&A also box at the bottom bar, where you can send your questions, and we will have at the end time for this. And in that chat box, you can introduce yourself, you can engage in the conversation, or let us know if you need any assistance. And with that, I'm happy to now start the panel and introduce myself. My name is Sana Mustafa. My personal pronouns are she and hers. I'm a Syrian feminist, human rights defender, and inclusion activist. I was brought up to speak up and dismantle systems of oppression, from the Assad regime in Syria to colonial systems in the forced displacement sector. And currently I am the Director of Partnerships and Engagement at Asylum Access. And what to expect today. I will just give us all an intro to the panel and the conversation, and then I will introduce our panelists, and we will hear from them and have a discussion. And we will try to make sure to leave at least 20 minutes at the end for Q&A, and we will talk about next steps. And from here, this panel, this event is happening because we wanted to take the opportunity at Asylum Access to launch this position paper that we've been working on, titled as Shifting Power and Forced Displacement and Building Equitable Partnerships. And we really see this discussion, the discussion around building equitable partnerships, as part of a bigger discussion around decolonization and localization in our sector. And gladly, in recent years, we have seen growing calls towards localization in the humanitarian and forced displacement sector. And ideally, I think when we talk about localization, ideally it's about shifting power actually to local actors, from international actors to local actors. And at Asylum Access, we define and we see one step towards shifting this power is building equitable partnerships. And the way we understand equitable partnerships are those partnerships where systems, processes, and daily interactions are actually helping in rectify power imbalances that enable exclusion in our system. That's ideally. Unfortunately, currently in our sector, most of the partnerships between international organization and multilateral organization and local actors with refugee-led organizations, they don't reflect that. And we see that this is really rooted, if we try to think about where this is coming from, we see this really rooted in the forced displacement sector colonial past, as well as the ongoing structural racism and bias. The result in that partnership processes and approaches currently from international actor to local actor are exclusive, and they really starve local actors from access to funding and access to key decision-making spaces. We also see the systematic exclusion of local actors, especially refugee-led organizations, play out in various ways. For example, the requirement for fluency in English, the strict timelines, and all the common standard practices of white dominant professional culture, the perception of weak capacity and the lack of technical skills, which leads to overemphasizing on capacity building instead of mutual knowledge exchange. Not to mention the lack of trust, which leads to short-term funding and collaboration, And of course, the disrespectful treatment of so many of the refugee leaders and local leaders, and the lack of trauma-informed engagement, which I'm positive many persons of forced displacement, starting with myself, could testify for having experienced that in our sector. So the exclusion of local actors is also not speaking in terms of just the ways of working, it's statistically speaking. Unfortunately, despite the best intentions, and I feel maybe we need to make a disclaimer here, it's not about anyone's intentions, it's about the impact. Despite the best intentions from the global commitment towards localization, we estimate that around 1% of the $30 billion circulating within the humanitarian system, around 1% goes to refugee-led organizations. So local actors are being systematically also starved from funding. And we really see this moment as it's time for radical change. And radical change will take radical action. You know, in times of Black Lives Matter, Indigenous rights movements, women rights movement, I think all of us collectively as a sector should come together and pause and stop. Where are we in the refugee rights movement? What is our role? How are we enabling or disenabling refugee leadership? And what does true allyship actually means in practice? During this conversation, many of you might feel uncomfortable and challenged, but I invite you, all of us, to sit through this feelings with humility. And remember that the ultimate goal here is for us to leave asking the right questions. And I want you to know that you will hopefully also leave knowing that you have resources and you have support system that you could tap into, as we all think collectively on which side of the movements we want history to remember us. And with that, I'm very happy to start introducing you to my amazing, brilliant panelists. And with that, I'll start with Tammam. Tammam Aloudat will talk to us about the history of structural racism and bias within the forced displacement sector, humanitarian and development sector. Tammam himself is a Syrian physician and the managing director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. His career in medical humanitarianism spanned 2 decades with the International Federation of the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, MSF, and been engaged in issues related to quality of medical humanitarian care, access to medicine, and the movement of decolonized humanitarian assistance and global health. After that, we will hear from Mohamed Ahmed, who will talk to us about the exclusion of refugee-led organization in the forced displacement sector and how this exclusion hinders the impact and harms forcibly displaced persons and RLOs. Mohammed himself is from Sudan and has been the director of programs at St. Andrew Refugee Services in Cairo since 2016. After that, we will go and hear from Sarah Smith, who will talk to us about practical solutions and shifting power within our sector, such as through funding. Sarah leads the Hilton Foundation Homelessness, Refugee, and Safe Water Initiative. She has worked in the Middle East for over 20 years, and prior joining the foundation, she was the head of education child protection at the IRC. And last but not least, we will hear from my colleague Diana Essex-Lettieri, who will launch officially the Asylum Access Equitable Partnerships Guidelines as concrete examples and foundation to address how we can address structural racism in our organization at Asylum Access and in the sector. Diana is the Vice President and COO of at Asylum Access and has previously worked at Oxfam America and the African Conservation Center, where she leads small-scale development projects in refugee camps in Zambia. And with that, we will have at the end also time for Q&A, and we will talk about next steps and how to have resources to move forward. So I would love to start with you, Tammam, and would love for you to tell us why, from your perspective, from the research that you've been doing, why do you think, why does the humanitarian system seem to be constantly incapable of moving towards equity and justice for the people that we claim that we serve, despite all the current rhetoric and efforts around localization?
Thank you, Sana. Thank you very much. And thank you for Asylum Access for hosting the event today and for asking the questions in a way that leaves no doubt about the starting point that we're coming from. So it's absolutely interesting to think, why are we sitting here, and what history forces us to be facing the questions here. Now, the humanitarian system, when I joined as a volunteer in the Red Crescent in Syria too long ago to comfortably admit, the first stories that you're told, the myth making of the humanitarian system, and this is not a bad thing, by the way. Each movement, each discipline requires its founding myth. But as it happens, our founding myths are of a Genevan gentleman who has been accidentally in a place of a battle, and the urge to help the soldiers affected by that battle. And here I'm talking about Henri Dunant and the Battle of Solferino in 1859, caused him to write a book to create the Red Cross, and effectively what is considered to be the modern iteration of humanitarianism, the Western European secular humanitarianism that still lives today and dominates what is perceived to be proper humanitarianism. One of the things that very few people ask is, how come this gentleman was there? And here the first dichotomy of our story starts, because while he was there helping soldiers, the reasons he was there is because he had interests in colonial Algeria that weren't served by French administrators, and hence he was going to complain to the French emperor. And I think there are two fascinating points here. First is the founder of modern humanitarianism had, like many of the history of that time, been entangled and benefited from the colonial history of Europe. He had the ability to exploit the colonization of other people. And the second thing was that when he wasn't served by administrators well, his reaction was to actually go and complain to the emperor. Not all of us can go to the emperor whenever an administrator or a bureaucrat that doesn't serve our interest. And the reason I mentioned that is that, like much else, our starting point is of privilege, of the ability to be in a place where you have access to power and where you benefit from the exploitation of that power. I don't want to illustrate that in dark, in exclusively dark colors, because that is also governed by its time and place. So rather than vilify Henri Dunant or the creation of the Red Cross, my question is, how come we are still today, 160 years later, seem to be acting within the same ethos of someone who needs to benefit from privilege, exploitation, class, and the colonial legacies? And I think part of the answer lies in the humanitarian sector having been stuck into a worldview that comes from that world, from a Western framework of thought that refuses to change easily. Let me put it in a couple of examples. One of them is one of the founders of modern thought in humanitarianism, Jean Pictet, who's another Genevan gentleman, said in 1979 that when faced with the impossibility of being a champion of charity and of justice at the same time, humanitarianism, and by that he was talking about the ICRC, has firmly chosen charity over justice. The entitlement by which that was said, without the need of evidence, is fascinating, but that's not the important part. The important part is that we still think, in a humanitarian world of today, that there's an exclusivity of choosing either justice or charity or the assistance of others. So let's think for a second about the implications of that. First, there's no evidence that there is an exclusivity between justice and aid. The second actually is one would think at this day and age that the exclusion of working towards justice puts us at this mechanical, the only aim is to save lives at any cost, whether they want to be saved or not, by the way. And however we deem as humanitarian sector for them to need to be saved. This is exactly what the white savior complex comes to play. I will save your life despite you, not with you. I will do it in the way I deem feasible and appropriate, regardless to what you actually want. So this puts us in a place where I think it's important to acknowledge this being a systemic issue. It is not a trait of any given single person. I'm not claiming, I don't think anyone claims that there is like a layer of evil humanitarians who are plotting the, the structural discrimination in the sector and how do they dominate the world. This is not a conspiracy theory. Neither does it accuse individuals. Actually, the sad part of it is, while everyone who joins this sector starts from an eagerness that is intrinsic to help others, the structural discrimination that is built in it, and that is, let's be clear, built in it because it functions within a capitalist, exploitative, neo-colonial, and hyper-nationalist environment, and doesn't reject them in favor of a better world, ends up turning those people who start from the best effective desire to help others into cogs of a machine that ends up exploiting them. This is why I think that conscientious move away from the apolitical, disengaged humanitarianism into one that considers itself as part of a solution, both because that differentiation between justice and aid shouldn't be the case, but also because we are going to face problems in the future that cannot be solved apolitically or with this concern for justice. One of them we're still in today, and the vaccine apartheid of COVID attests to that. But the others is, if we're concerned today with the 70 million displaced people, forcibly displaced people in the world, think about 15 years ago when the lack of political will fails to contain climate change, and when we might face tens, if not hundreds of millions of displaced people. Humanitarianism will be asked to respond to that, and that would be impossible without concern for climate justice, but also without an active engagement with the people who will be requiring that assistance. I will stop here and wait until we have the chance to discuss. Thank you very much again.
No, thank you, Tammam. I have one follow-up. I mean, you mentioned very eloquently how this is not a conspiracy theory, obviously. Like, this is about the system, this is about the past and how the system was started and continues to. But clearly, I mean, we as individuals and our organizations have a role in it, whether benefiting from it or contributing to it or not trying to counter the counter practices. So what would you say to, like, could humanitarian/international organization actually do to move towards more equitable and humanitarian system?
I think, talking about refugee-led organizations is a proxy, is a step towards talking about full agency for people affected by emergencies. The goal isn't going to be, let's move the control over people's lives from foreigners to locals. It is just one step towards acknowledging the agency and independence and ownership over their lives of people who are affected by emergencies. The first step would be acknowledging that those people know best what they need to get out of the crisis they are in. And that is not embedded or implicit in humanitarian aid today. There's an acceptance of either like the technical expert model where I know because I am an expert, or the even worse humanitarian imperative. I have the right to decide over other people's lives because I feel the humanitarian imperative. In both cases, the assumption is there's a legitimacy to deciding on behalf of people without their involvement. This has been combated on all levels. When we talk about nothing about us without us in politics or in aid, it is the similar one, except that when the aid and the money and the resources and the epistemological framework under which all that takes place is foreign to people. And when we get together to create that image of them being incapable of making decisions on their own behalf, we do them disservice. There's, of course, in acute and severe situations, the days after an earthquake, or very difficult to imagine many more, but where there is an engagement that needs to be done on behalf of people. But short of that, think about it. I will think about it from a medical point of view. If someone arrives unconscious to an emergency room after an accident, my obligation as a physician is to provide every treatment I can. The moment they have consciousness, then my only obligation is to follow the consent that they desire. We don't do that in humanitarianism, and that might be a good model to follow.
That's a great example to earn that. Thank you, Tammam. Mohammed, I would love to move to you. You're on the other side. You're on the receiving end as a leader in a refugee-led organization of these systematic exclusion practices, and for years. So could you please maybe share with us how this systematic exclusion affected your organization and STARS?
Thank you so much, Sana. Thank you so much. A couple of years ago, two of our refugee staff were rejected from a UNHCR training. It was a UNHCR-led training on community-based protection. When we asked why, we were told that because we needed to send senior staff. And when we explained that those were actually senior staff, we were then told openly that their staff will not feel comfortable talking about refugees in front of our refugee staff, stating that there was a conflict of interest between their ethnic loyalties and their professional obligations. We have had refugee staff asked to leave meetings covering community-based protection again, while non-refugee staff of STARS, mainly Western migrant workers, were allowed to the meeting. And these are not isolated incidents. They are not only faced by our organization, but by all local RLOs. We are experiencing resistance to our approach to refugee leadership. RLOs and RLO networks are excluded from attending working groups at UNHCR and INGOs meetings. Refugee community schools representatives, for example, are not invited to the education working group meetings, despite providing education services to the vast majority of refugee children. UNHCR do not hire refugees beyond interpreters level, at least in our context for sure. Even then, interpreters cannot ride on the staff bus. They cannot use the staff rooms. They are in a different pay scale, much lower than other staff. Due to this systematic exclusion, we are unable to advocate for refugees, unable to provide constructive solutions or share our views on many issues. Due to this systematic exclusion of RLOs, UNHCR and INGOs cut themselves out of the reality, cut themselves out of valuable knowledge, practical knowledge of what is really happening. They do not only cut themselves out, but also cut donors and funding institutions out of the picture, due to this, donors and funding institutions cannot hear fully what is actually happening on the ground. What alternatives are there to improve the situation? In our context, this systematic exclusion of RLOs puts pressure on STARS as an organization. Our partner RLOs, local RLOs, have the potential to assist, but they lack the resources to do so. The demand on STARS services is too high as a result, and we cannot manage effectively most of the time the pressure. The pressure on UNHCR and its implementing partners and also INGOs is also increasing as a result of this exclusion. Now they cannot obviously meet the demands. They do not have they do not have sufficient knowledge or expertise to do this. Their services are far more costly to run compared to local RLOs, far more complicated. And this would naturally lead to refugee situations deteriorating even more over time. Back to you, Sana.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, I feel like, I hope people who are listening, who feel they are the exception, we probably are the exception, but here we're talking about a bigger system. It's not about one individual case or an exceptional organization. At the end of the day, this is valid, this is happening, so please listen. Mohammed, so what would be your recommendation for international organizations that are looking to partner with RLOs, maybe with STARS? What would be your recommendation for them for these partnerships, and also for donors maybe who want to engage directly and fund your organization or other refugee-led organizations?
Just before that, if I can talk about, the impact of directly funding RLOs is obvious. Now the impact is more powerful and immediate than the current system, more evident and concrete than the current system. RLOs can reach places that INGOs cannot. They are by far best positioned to identify and respond to the needs of their community. They can reach more marginalized groups. Refugees struggle to reach to INGOs for assistance, right? But that is not the case with RLOs. Direct funding to RLOs ensures a much more higher number of vulnerable displaced people get access, safe and sustainable access to essential services within their local areas. Now, the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative has enabled STARS to connect with other RLOs globally and exchange experiences and views. STARS has learned a lot and is learning a lot from our fellow RRLI members. We have been exploring new avenues, sharing information and advocating for change in a wider context. Now, coming to your questions, I think there are three main steps for donors and INGOs to partner successfully with RLOs. The first one is the willingness to accept that the current system is failing. Now, we believe that INGOs tend to work with projects, not with communities. These projects come and go without making real changes in people's lives. As Sana mentioned earlier in the introduction, the system is functioning on a colonial model basis. What we often get is projects designed in the global West and delivered in the global South with no input from the local populations who these interventions are meant to serve. During COVID, RLOs have become the main source of protection for their communities, playing a frontline role as first responders, demonstrating the unsustainability of INGOs' work during crisis and when it is most needed, basically. They simply shut down and left, most of them. So the willingness to accept this failure in the system, in my opinion, necessitates a second step, which is fundamental change in policy, in guidelines, in reporting requirements, and in organizational culture generally. It is very important to have a shift in thinking. Now, the third and the last main point maybe is that INGOs should have the role to help strengthening the technical capacity of RLOs instead of attempting to provide direct assistance. Currently, we believe that there is no fair distribution of resources between INGOs and RLOs, even when they jointly implement a project. Now, when an INGO partners with a refugee-led organization in a project, for example, the common practice is that the INGO gets the entire amount of the budget overhead, and the refugee-led organization gets nothing, despite the fact that most of the work is already done by the refugee-led organization on the ground. So back to you, Sarah.
Mohammed, every time I hear you speak, I'm like, and I think people in the chat too, like we just want to quote you on everything you say, because there's so much truth, there's so much power in just simple, obvious truth. So thank you for that. What would be also your recommendations? So you mentioned your recommendations to INGOs and donors to help partner with refugee-led organizations. What would be your recommendations to refugee-led organizations who will be engaging in those partnerships?
I guess there is very little actually for RLOs to be doing, right? I mean, I would say to my fellow RLOs that in my opinion, I think change is coming. It seems more inevitable now than ever. It will take some time, I believe, and it will take like effort and thought, and there will be challenges, ups and downs. But as RLOs, we need to keep in mind that our solutions are far more impactful, cost efficient, and immediate than the current system. As RLOs, I would also say maybe we need to continue doing the good work we do. We need to show our ability to run projects successfully. We need to show the quality and the range of services, the wraparound nature of the services we provide. We need to continue being responsive to the community needs, our community needs, and also to responsive to donors as well. So I guess this is what we can do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. So I guess now that we've heard from Tammam about acknowledgement of where the system is rooted, and from Mohammed about the impact of the behavior of the system on people themselves, would love now to hear from funders and from allies and INGOs about what does it mean to be a true ally. Saya, I would love to move to you right now. And so Hilton Foundation has been in the recent years leading on also direct funding for refugee-led organization. And I think when we talk to many funders, they, direct funding, it comes with so much of risk and fear. So I'm just curious if you can share with us the journey that you're aware of that Hilton has been taking, the challenges and the opportunities that have risen through direct funding to RLOs.
Thank you, Sana, and thanks to Asylum Access for hosting this. It's a great discussion. I'm so happy to be here. So I joined the Hilton Foundation about a year ago, and one of the reasons I joined the foundation was because it was already very committed to investing in national and subnational community-based organizations. And it had, similar to what a lot of organizations had done prior to the World Humanitarian Summit, had committed to 25% of its funding going to local organizations, especially for our newest initiative, which is focused on refugees and people affected by forced displacement. So our journey really has just begun. I'll talk about a few steps we've taken this year and some of the challenges we've faced. The first challenge I faced in the role was really quite practical. There was no easy go-to source to find organizations in the countries and sectors that we were focused on. I knew of many of them, but we didn't have a real place to go to. And so to overcome this, we did a couple things. First, we hired consultants from the countries where we were focused and asked them to help us map national and subnational organizations that were focused on the sectors that we were focused on. We also funded a project that's led by Adesso, which many of you probably know, to create an online platform, sort of like a LinkedIn for organizations. And the goal of this platform is to increase the visibility and profile of grassroots organizations and other organizations that wouldn't maybe be connected to one another in the Global South in particular. So then the other challenge that we faced right away was also practical. We're a relatively small foundation and leanly staffed, and so we need to actually limit the number of grants that we can make. And for larger donors with significant funding, this can be an even bigger challenge. So one of the solutions to this, I think, is working with coalitions. We funded the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative, which we're so honored to be a part of. And we've also funded a local coalition accelerator in Uganda, and have really looked at different coalition models to try to be able to make larger grants to a coalition of community-based organizations. And then lastly, we've also really focused on making sure we're not just funding local, national, refugee-led organizations, but we're also listening to those organizations and getting their feedback and input into what we're doing. One of the things we're doing as a foundation is a project focused on ethical storytelling and representation. And this project is not just for ourselves, but also for our grantees, including our international NGO grantees, many of which are very interested in changing the way they represent their clients and tell stories and represent the stories and issues of their clients. This is something that I think goes back to one of Tammam's point about shifting power through how we represent the work that is being done. We're also, one of the more recent pieces of work we're doing is also a study with refugee-led organizations to get their specific feedback on our strategy and to get their input into what the barriers are that they face and which of the programs that they find to be most promising. So like I said, we're at the beginning of our journey. We have a long way to go, but really happy to be on it with you all in particular. Back to you, Sana.
Thank you, Sarah. No, I'm glad you're on the journey. Welcome. And it sounds like you're doing amazing work from whether, from looking inwards and thinking about the presentation and the ethical storytelling, or through your programming strategies and direct funding. If a donor comes to you right now and says like, okay, well, we're thinking about exploring how to directly fund refugee-led organizations, what would your advice be to them?
Well, I think donors face different challenges. Certainly, I think often in private donors and philanthropy face obstacles, but probably very different from some of the bilateral and public donors. But I would offer 3 suggestions, perhaps. One is not to make assumptions. We've talked a bit about this already, but I think there are a lot of assumptions that have no evidence, in fact, behind them in our sector. And things like local organizations are inherently riskier than international organizations. This isn't borne out in fact, and shouldn't be an assumption out there. The assumption that local organizations need their capacity built, or that international NGOs are better suited to build capacity is another one. And so I would say first, just lead with humility, as you said, and don't make assumptions. The second one, I think, relates to setting targets. You know, I think when donors set targets, it doesn't always lead to real change, but if they do it and they publicize it, I think oftentimes it can trigger the internal changes that need to be made. Funders ask grantees all the time to set measurable targets for their projects, so we should do the same for our grant making. We just went through this process as the Hilton Foundation. The first thing we did was for setting a target for how much of our funding goes to local organizations. So the first thing we did was define the different kinds of organizations that we're funding using clear objective criteria, a typology of sorts. And I think it's important for us to, and donors out there, to be honest about the starting point. For us, we funded about 20% of our funding this year went directly to local organizations, not through any intermediaries. And about another 22% went to local organizations through intermediaries. And I think it's important for donors to be honest about where they are right now, and that can lead to change. The last thing I would say is really to be creative and to find all the creativity that's out there. There's some donors that in the near term probably won't be able to fund directly to certain kinds of organizations, but there are so many things that they could fund that would help the sector change. Funding regional networks, for instance, funding research and evaluations that help local organizations, refugee-led organizations, demonstrate their impact, and funding their international partners to change the way they represent their partnerships, the way they represent their clients, the way they get feedback from and give feedback back to their local partners is another idea. But there are thousands out there. I'm sure just in this webinar alone, we could generate more for other donors to fund.
We're definitely, thank you so much, Saya. We're definitely planning on hosting a discussion specifically about that. But thank you so much for sharing all these recommendations. And just one comment on intermediaries, like it's really thing, and what I say right now, at least if you're going to go back with an intermediary, then choose the refugee-led intermediary at least. Now we have a refugee-led organization at the capacity to do that, or coalitions, as you mentioned. Thank you, Saya, again. Now over to you, Diana, to officially launch this paper, the Equitable Partnerships paper. So now that we've heard about the history of our system, the impact of it on our laws, and one example of an ally, a donor of what could be done, can we hear from why Asylum Access, as a non-refugee-led organization, as an ally so far, have launched this paper? Why have we thought about it, and what our journey has been so far?
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to my fellow panelists. The paper was born of many things for Asylum Access. During discussions on how to support the localization movement and the refugee leadership movement, which are led by great organizations, movements led by great organizations like ADESO or the Global Refugee-Led Network or NEAR, we were acknowledging that partnerships with local organizations and RLOs was going to be critical. And we wanted to know how we could do that ethically. So these guidelines emerged internally as a way to respond to that concern of how do we do this ethically. Around the same time, we had begun our own diversity, equity, and inclusion learning journey internally. And so we were doing a lot of reflecting anyway. And as we were in the midst of this journey, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States was really growing in prominence. And in the spring of 2020, when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered, was when we were picking up and thinking about these guidelines, and the conversation in the United States around how do you combat systemic racism was really present. And upon reflection, as we were thinking about partnerships, we realized that if done the right way, that partnerships could provide us an opportunity to combat systemic racism within forced displacement. And then finally, and importantly, the guidelines emerged as a way to create accountability for ourselves, accountability to our values, and as a way to prevent mistakes. And they were internal at first, and then we realized that if we made them external, it would just promote accountability and hopefully start a conversation. And we note that these are it's a living document. It's a living document, and the more people who contribute to the conversation, the stronger that the guidelines will get. But we had made some mistakes in partnerships, and it was because we were on this learning journey, and because we had seen what was happening in the United States, that we were reflecting on the mistakes that we'd made. So a couple examples of mistakes. One is that we had been working with a local partner over several years, and when it came time to seek funding, we pushed what we would now recognize to be really Western ways of working, rooted in white dominant professional culture, things like promoting a sense of urgency, being timeline driven, output focused, and very little upfront investment in relationship building. And so in this way, we weren't being culturally sensitive, and ultimately it broke trust, and the partner pulled out of the project. And because we had the direct relationship with the donor, we were able to continue on and seek other partners. Since then, and because of our learning, we've really sought to repair the relationship with the local partner, and trying to create the kind of accountability internally that this kind of an issue wouldn't happen again. And to offer just one other example, we were asked by a donor to run a quote unquote capacity building program for several local organizations. And ultimately, the donor and Asylum Access set the capacity building agenda together. There was consultation with local partners, but it was far from what we would consider an equitable partnership. And although the relationships between Asylum Access and the local partners remain really strong, ultimately, arguably the impact was just so-so. And the donor did pull out of the project shortly thereafter. And in moments like this, I remain very curious what would have happened had the program been genuinely inclusively designed, co-owned through an equitable partnership. And a side note here too, that we now recognize, as several of my fellow panelists have pointed out, that the notion of doing a capacity building program at all is really riddled with assumptions about whose knowledge matters most, and often paint non-white populations as lacking relevant knowledge. Obviously, when you put it in these terms, it's very offensive and inaccurate. So through the course of our learning journey and reflecting on these mistakes, we really realized that these kinds of issues were working against the movements that we were saying vocally that we wanted to uphold, the refugee leadership movement and the localization movement, which are really connected to the Asylum Access mission in many ways. And importantly, and we think this is not recognized enough, that these kinds of issues also have the possibility of bringing up memories of trauma for those that we're engaging with. For many people of forced displacement, there's a long history of experiencing oppression and exclusion, and to experience it again by actors who are purporting to support can be very disorienting, and we understand can be re-traumatizing. So over the last couple of years since we've drafted these internally, we've been using them, and we can say with confidence that they've led to very fruitful partnerships and tremendous impact, including but not limited to the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative.
Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing this journey. I've been part of it and I've been, witnessing it. And it's been really, as someone on the inside, it's been amazing to continue to witness it and to be part of it in many ways. And we're only getting better. Can you actually now, maybe we can talk about the paper itself. Can you tell us about the newly, now actually we can put the link in the chat for the published paper, our position paper titled as Equitable Partnership Guidelines. What's in it? What are the key messages that you would want people here to leave with?
Yeah, thank you. Importantly, up front, the primary audience for this paper is other international institutions, so INGOs and multilateral organizations. But really a lot of what we're saying we think is foundational to others, including host community-led local organizations who wish to partner with refugee-led organizations and also donors and beyond. The paper starts by trying to define what is an equitable partnership, and we define it as partnerships where systems, processes, and daily interactions can help to rectify power imbalances that enable the exclusion that many of the panelists have talked about. So in other words, partnerships, if done in this particular way, are a method of promoting systemic change. We further define what are the elements, foundational elements of an equitable partnership. And to summarize those quickly, co-design from the very beginning, not after funding has been secured. Co-leadership, so during the life of a project, leading a project together, and that there are structures that underpin and create accountability around the desire to promote co-leadership. Co-visibility, especially with donors and decision makers, so that there's an awareness of who is running the project together, or the local or refugee-led partner first and foremost, and then transparency, which is especially around budgeting, because as we all know, money is power. And then from there, we break down even more concrete guidance for how you could put some of these principles into action. And the first section of the paper is talking about the importance of committing to institutional change and learning. So this idea that we really need to look inward first. And to share a little bit about the asylum access journey with this learning, we've been working with a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, actually consultants now, more than one group for about 2 years. And we've gone through some direct training and lots of consultation on topics like DEI generally, cultural intelligence, white dominant professional culture, the history of colonialism, implicit bias, and most recently, trauma-informed engagement. And this learning at times was hard and uncomfortable, and because we committed to it, I think deeply transformative. So among other things that have come out of it have been major commitments to changing the composition of the asylum access team. So there's a representation commitment at both board level and at leadership levels, to really prioritize bringing in people who have experienced forced displacement, which really starts with overhauling recruitment and hiring practices. And also some major structures review for how we're making decisions, how we're setting budgets. And admittedly, we have a long road ahead of us to fully live our values through our structures, but we're walking into a new strategic planning phase, and it'll be exciting, I think, to figure out how we apply all of what we've learned to our internal hierarchies and processes. The second section of like, how do you put these principles into action is around creating accountability to that learning. And the paper recommends that when initiating a partnership, that there is a huge investment up front in developing a shared vision for both the partnership and how it's going to work, and also the project that you're going to be working on together. And we have realized that external facilitation from really well-trained, well-positioned facilitators who have experience or who are well-trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion principles can make a world of difference in promoting trust as you build a project together. And with that newfound trust, the paper recommends building the systems that create accountability to that, to co-leadership. So standard operating procedures, MOUs, because ultimately, if those guidelines, if the way you're going to work together are not structural, then they're not equitable. It's too easy for there to be default power with the international actor who more likely has strong relationships with donors and decision makers. And then finally, to do homework on cultural intelligence. You know, as we're engaging with partners, we need to be asking, how are we aware of our own cultural preferences? Are we aware of what other cultural preferences are being brought by partners? And when in doubt, ask. And personally, I think the hardest part about being culturally intelligent in these moments is to recognize that our cultural preferences can be harmful, both to the local partner, but also to ourselves. And then second, that cultural preferences can be easily misinterpreted. We can easily misinterpret our own cultural preferences to be better or to be necessary when they're not. And I think this is where we get really poorly executed capacity building programs that are expecting other cultures to conform. And the very last piece of the paper, and importantly, is the idea that international institutions need to decenter themselves within partnerships. And starting with before we're engaging with partnerships, are we asking what is our value add? Because if there isn't a really clear value add, perhaps one of the best things we can be doing is to step aside. But assuming that that assessment has been done and that the value add is clear, facilitating, well, actually, if you assess that you don't have a value add, facilitating direct relationships between local organizations and donors can be a huge support. And I just want to acknowledge that I think, having run an international NGO for several years now, it can be hard because, you know, sometimes we're running on tight margins too. But we have to set that aside in the name of the mission. But if we've done that assessment that we do have a value add, consider joint fundraising where the local organization is the lead applicant. And then, of course, decentering could be that we're facilitating access to decision-making spaces for local organizations, especially RLOs, which may require relinquishing our own spot or paying for the participation of others. And then the paper, which we really hope you'll read and share your thoughts with us on. The point of all of this is that if this was the predominant way that partnerships happen within the sector, we would see much greater funding to local organizations and RLOs, and the growth of great projects that leads to great impact. And it's because of that that we think that equitable partnerships are a key piece of systemic reform. That's it. Back to you, Sana.
Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing with us how maybe one way to realize true allyship is through building equitable partnerships with refugee-led organizations and local actors. And I definitely invite all of you to take a look at the paper, and we will be definitely having more discussions in the new year about it. Now we have some time for Q&A, and we've received very interesting questions in that chat, so thank you for that. And please, you can keep them coming. We have time for that. And so I will direct my first question to Tammam. This question, I think everyone loves. The question says, one of the most common justifications for resistance to shifting power from INGOs to national and sub-organization that people hear is concern over neutrality. So could you please tell us from your point of view, where do you feel this concern is coming from? Is it valid? You're muted.
Yes, of course it is valid. Absolutely. But let's examine it for a second. Neutrality is one of the humanitarian principles. Those came from the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movements. They were composed in 1965, and they were asserted by the UN General Assembly in 1991. This, mind you, all happened in the Cold War, where neutrality carried a dimension of neutrality in the bigger ideological debate of the time, and where it actually crumbled quite badly in the 90s. After that has become formal principle. The reason it did is because there wasn't like the global good versus bad, wherever your side is good, of course. But humanitarianism needed to navigate so they wouldn't be able to be blocked from the discussion. Neutrality was a sort of a description of the apolitical nature. And I mentioned the 1979 Jean Pictet argument that charity and justice cannot happen together. In 1999, the president of MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, gave a speech in the acceptance of Nobel Peace Prize, where he talked about the fundamental neutrality, the apolitical nature, but political implications of humanitarianism. And again, all this comes from an assumption that you can only do good if you distance yourself from both sides. There's a whole other argument where neutrality in reality is not a real principle. It is a behavior that is conducive to access in some situations, mostly historical situations. What happens today, and let's think about it for a second. What neutrality is being used for today in many cases is to exclude local actors. And there's some look now, and if you look at the Syria campaign's work, for example, with the White Helmets. White Helmets have saved more lives in Syria than any international NGO would hope to do in a lifetime. And that's indisputable. Yet they are not combated on their technical capacity or their choices of like picking children from under rubble of bombs. They are combated from being not neutral. And this, again, what in an idea that has had a usefulness historically becomes a weapon of exclusion. And this is also part of what being argued against today. We're saying whatever we have inherited as a sacralized and indisputable good in the humanitarian sector needs to be discussed and debated and argued against. Neutrality was useful one day, it's not really useful today. At least not in the same sense, and it has to be redefined along with the humanitarian principles. So my concern is not the failure of local actors to be neutral in the Western sense. My worry is about the continuing dominance of a Western view of what constitutes worthy humanitarian action, and then trying to fit local actors in it. This applies to neutrality, but also applies to effectiveness, what is effective or not, to the ability to the means of management, to the shape and form and hierarchies. All of it are demands that emanate from a historically Western perceptions of what's good and bad, and rather than change them with the changing time, we're demanding that local organizations or local populations conform with foreign concepts and ideas so they prove themselves to be worthy, rather than demanding the system change so it becomes worthy of serving the people it aims to serve.
Thank you so much, Tammam. That's a very insightful input. And it reminds me of what Mohammed was sharing. The concept of neutrality reminds me, and justification of using it over and over again reminds me of the incident Mohammed shared about UNHCR not letting refugee staff into the room because it's conflict of interest. And I find it very interesting is like not letting women into the room when it's like in the women's rights movement. Let's just hear from men. That would be ridiculous, right? I'm not sure how this is not ridiculous in our sector still. Thank you, Tammam, again. Maybe I'll have a question to Sarah. We received a question about curiosity around how Hilton define local organizations.
I got a much easier question, although it is harder than meets the eye. We actually used the IASC definition, the Humanitarian Financing Task Team that was set up by the Interagency Standing Committee, has a localization group, and they defined not just local organizations, but all kinds of institutions. Local, and I actually try more to refer to subnational organizations, are organizations operating in a specific geographically defined and subnational area of a country. We do distinguish between national and subnational organizations, and refugee-led organizations are yet again a distinct group. But the IASC guidelines I can put in the chat, and there are many debates, I'm sure, to be had about the definitions themselves, but I found them to be a helpful starting point.
Thank you. Actually, definitions are really difficult. So thank you for sharing that. Maybe Diana, back to you. We have a very interesting question, especially I feel like just 2 weeks ago, Samantha Power of USAID have announced that 25% of USAID funding would be going to local organizations in the next 5 years. So this is a huge new development. It's a good percentage. Where do you feel like, how do you feel INGOs are being receptive to this and actually being able maybe to connect? What would message you be like to connect this commitment to equitable partnerships?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think a natural thing for INGOs to be asking themselves right now is, how do I participate ethically in this? I mean, I know that's the question that I'm asking myself pretty constantly, both as a white woman in this space and as an American working in a global organization. I think asking what your value add in this conversation can have many answers, and there can be many valid answers. This is my opinion. I think that no matter what that answer needs to include, how am I part of shifting power? How am I a part of helping the commitments to localization be successful? How am I a part of ensuring that the voices of those most affected are being heard by decision makers and standing behind those requests? And if the answers to all of those are sound, then I think it's a great starting point. I mean, Asylum Access, I would say, has very specific value adds to the conversation. In addition to shifting power, you know, we have technical expertise in legal empowerment. We have technical expertise in advocacy tactics. And within Mexico, Thailand, and Malaysia, we also have very specific proximate knowledge to bring to the table. And so I don't think it's like there's no one size fits all answer. So as long as that reflection is being done and we're being honest with ourselves and doing the right learning that enables the right reflection, then I think that we all have an important role to play.
Thank you. And as I have you here, probably it's a question on so many people's mind. How do you see also the role and composition of asylum access changing over time?
Yeah, at the Global Refugee Forum, Asylum Access made some public commitments to representation, and actually since then we've increased those commitments, specifically for our global leadership team, which is, I would say, the INGO component of Asylum Access is our global leadership team and our global systems change team, that we've committed to being 40% refugee-led by 2024. And our board of directors, our global board of directors, which is also very supportive and excited about this transition for the organization, has committed to be 60% refugee-led by 2026. And so, you know, people can have mixed feelings about quotas, but in our experience, changing who's in the culture of asylum access has enabled shifts to be faster, more natural, and has helped those of us with more privilege to understand our privilege quicker. Not that we're trying to put the onus to educate on those who come through the doors, but it has happened organically, and we're grateful for those contributions.
Thank you, Diana. There's a very interesting question I would ask to all of you, and anyone who's interested in answering, please unmute yourself or let us know. The question reads as, based on the history of the sector, which we have spoken of, the pace of change can often be slow, given the bureaucracy and long-held notions of best practices. So at this point, do you see the way to shift power through evolution, revolution, based on what you've seen and experienced thus far? So change is slow. What do you see the way to get this change?
Well, it's if no one is, I mean, we're doing a couple of things here. First, using coloniality as a framework to address the continuing legacy of colonialism, but also the continuing legacies of other exploitative systems, gives an impression that the only way to change the system to the better is to overthrow the system. And I don't think this is accurate. And this is part of the risk of using a metaphor like this, because not because the system is not in need of an overhaul, but because today with the same spirit we're talking about in the sense of people need to take charge of their fate. None of us here, we are here privileged by definition. Being here is a marker of our privilege. Even if we come from communities that are affected or that are has the moral standing to make a decision on behalf of everybody else. We're not a representative of anybody except ourselves, and to the best of our ability, try to do that well. So the humanitarian system still provides aid to many people and saves lives and is populated and capable of doing a lot. I don't think we have the ability to say overthrow the system today just so we'd rebuild supposedly a better system in the future. So that aside, then it takes away at least the traditional evolution versus revolution conceptions. It takes away also there's no guarantee, neither historical nor real logical, of changing the leadership alone being a force for good. And I mean, you know, the historical colonialism it was evicted, leaving place for historical dictatorships and post-colonial tyrannies that are very local. So my argument is there is a need for change that doesn't need to be enacted by an elite from the top down, and doesn't need to replace white people with brown people as the, you know, that's automatically going to make everything better. There's a need for change that needs to be enacted by people who are by people who are in need of humanitarian assistance, by people who are displaced, and with the aid of people closest to them, whoever calls themselves humanitarian today. It's a shift of power that happens every day. Every time I get to make a decision, I need to think twice about who's better off making it than I am. And how can I serve that? Today, a normal practice in humanitarian setting is to send a foreigner to do an evaluation to decide what programs need to happen. And then they go and, you know, sit and drink tea with someone and pretend to have consulted with the community. How about we, instead of overthrowing the system, make it a norm that people go and tell refugees or displaced populations, look, this is what I know how to do as a humanitarian actor. This is my experience. At your service, what do you want done as a community, rather than I will do this for you and, you know, you like it or not. That I'm convinced that those shifts in power systematized is what will make a change that will force the system to change. And of course, that's not to the exclusion of conscientious changes in representation, changes in direction and in perceptions. But I doubt that a singular top-down vanguard of rebels will change the system well enough to create something sustainable and workable for the future.
Thank you so much, Tammam. I have a few comments on that I would love to add, but Saya, Mohamed, and Diana, anything you would like to add on this question? Yeah, I think, thank you so much, Tammam, definitely. I think the message that you left about the last thing that you said around asking and listening from those who are non-refugees, the refugees about what they want and how they want it. is definitely one way. I think this whole conversation, maybe like one message to reiterate, is not about excluding anyone. It's about acknowledgement of history and how it manifests in the present. It's about acknowledgement of current dynamics. It's about acknowledgement of imbalances in power, and then coming together as an ecosystem collectively to recognize what are our roles individually, as on an individual level, interpersonal level, organizational level, and systematic level. And with that, I actually would love to invite all of you to share any final thoughts you have, or things that you would like to leave the audience with. So maybe I'll start with you, Mohammed.
Sorry. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I mean, we believe that refugee leadership and participation is indispensable to any meaningful movement for change. We also believe in being flexible and adaptable when working with other laws, but at the same time, we also believe in being accountable and transparent, right? And I always say we always say here in STARS, that when it comes to designing and implementing interventions, as Tammam and everyone was saying, we believe that displaced people should not have only a seat at the table, actually displaced people on the table. Within our initiative, we also don't expect less from refugee leaders and RLOs, but we do understand that we need to support more. We can't expect displaced people to perform exactly as Western migrant workers. Refugees are dealing with a range of complex problems. They are dealing with the forced displacement experience and the trauma they have from their countries of origin, their separation from families and support networks, dealing with being a refugee, an outsider excluded in a foreign country. But they are making the decision to help other displaced people. So that's why we support more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Saya?
Thanks, Sana. It's hard to follow Mohammed. I think just from my side, the point you made, Sana, about acknowledgement and really deep reflection on the part of donors, international organizations, and those that are in the space that really are seeking to change, I think is a critical first step. I think also because I'm here speaking as a donor, I think that any of the donors out there in this meeting are probably already, so to speak, the converted, but I think for those of us on this call have a responsibility to go out and talk to other donors and other international organizations and push for their own recognition and acknowledgement, and really question whether some of the changes that are often seen as too monumental or too big are really too big to change, because I think we're all optimistic and ambitious people trying to and I think that ultimately these are things that can be changed within our communities. So thanks again for having me.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you, Saya. And I definitely agree. It's been transformative in the last 2 years to see how a lot of the allies, whether other peer organizations or funders who have realized the importance of direct funding and engaging with RLOs, have brought others on board. And I do definitely agree with this importance role of mobilizing others. So thank you for mentioning it. Diana?
Yeah, thanks for this second to close up. I think my final thoughts are just that, Asylum Access recognizes that there are many things that need to happen in order to shift power within forced displacement. But we started with equitable partnerships because it was highly relevant to us internally and what we needed to do and how we needed to change. And it's also just something that most of us can do right now. I mean, I think there's a lot that feels outside of our control or outside of our hands. The history of colonialism is big and complex, but there's things we can do immediately to help try to rectify power imbalances. And we've tried to put some of those things forward, and just to remind that, we consider it a living document, and we'd love to hear what people think about the paper and how to make it better or stronger.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. I do feel like, people could feel in this conversation, it's huge, because we're talking about systems and history, and sometimes it might feel irrelevant and relevant and big, but also change happens as like on the daily interactions. Partnerships is really daily interactions. So there are, please take a look at the position paper. There are tips and ways and advices and resources to how, at least in your next meeting after this webinar, how could this next meeting could be done better. Now over to you, Tammam. Would love to hear your final thoughts.
Thank you. I mean, thank you all, but Diana, you've just said rightly, we have inherited a long history and a complex one, and decolonizing historically has failed. Yes, there are nations that have gained their political independence, but people in those nations still suffer the consequences of colonialism. And those consequences translate into everyday things like who gets a vaccine for COVID and who doesn't. And the maps of colonialism translate into maps of longevity, of wealth, of health, and of choice and agency. And we have to navigate within the middle of all that. So I absolutely buy into like starting with equitable partnership rather than that becoming the all-encompassing, and that's important because diversity and inclusion and representation are absolutely important, but are but a minor step that is possible to exploit. And Sarah Ahmed wrote a brilliant book about in being included on how equity regimes can become exploited to serve inequity regimes, and that can happen particularly with diversity and inclusion. At the end of the day, we're in a time and place where in Denmark and in the UK, the two ministers who are leading the charge against refugees are two sons and daughters of refugees and migrants. The just representation on its own doesn't guarantee much if it's not supported by a self-examining, critical view of what's right and what's wrong that evolves with people and their practice. The last thing, just one more thing. I think it is absolutely important to keep framing the sort of possible, hopeful, emancipatory direction of humanitarianism, not as a replacement of some people with other people, because we can have another session on how problematic is those of us who are brown and black and work in the system at a level where we're likely to be hired. And I name myself before. We come from a privileged part of our own communities, and we are no guarantee to act in a way that is equitable to everybody in the places we come from, and we don't represent them. And our job is to make it more possible for them to be represented, not to, rest assured that everything is fine because we're hired or people like us. So this is the first thing. And the second thing is that all is predicated on starting to reject systematically what is considered universal knowledge that is inherited from a Western perspective, and start to accept that there's no gold standard except that is defined democratically and by what some call radical democracy, by people who are going to benefit from this. They have a choice regardless to our desires for what gold standard or technical expertise or so on decides. And the one thing I find a good exercise to avoid the abstraction of all this, if you're going to go and endorse or design or fund an action or a program, think whether you would it would have passed in the country you're in the UK or the US or Europe. If you want to choose people and ignore people, or do something without consultation or without consent or so on, would that have happened unobjectionable in the place you're funding from or designing from? If the answer is no, then there's absolutely no reason for it to go where just because you have power, you can implement it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammam, and thank you, Saya, Mohammed, and Diana, and all of those who attended. The discussion does not end here. We wanted to create an alternative space to have acknowledgement and to have resources on how to move forward. And so you will see in the chat this poll. If you're interested in continuing the discussion in the new year about how to shift power in the forced displacement sector, please do engage with the poll so we follow up with you. And I just want to say that, as I said, this is not the last conversation. This is only the beginning. In the next year, we will be planning webinars and peer learning and creating spaces for conversations about direct funding, equitable partnerships, and equal practices in our sector. And with that, I really want to thank our interpreters as well, Marcella and the team from Natakallam. And I want to give shout out to all the people from Asylum Access who worked on putting this together, and all of you who took time from your day and joined us. And please do reach out to us. And we really hope to continue to create this space for the conversations. And thank you again for my fellow panelists. Have a great day, everyone.